For the past few days since I've arrived in Australia, and I've had conversations with numerous people from various backgrounds, various ages. One thing that I have noticed, which is different from my previous visits to Australia, is that the appetite for the discussion on the elections is almost, in my opinion, almost unprecedented. The interest that people are taking, the kind of notions of where does Gaza, particularly Gaza, Palestine, generally speaking, where does that fit in the whole discussion about which parties, which candidates? The whole discussion about the ruling party with its absolutely obscene position generally on Gaza, but with people who are really good when it comes to Gaza. So where do we go with that? That kind of discussion is a discussion that I never remember having. And by the way, this isn't just here in Australia. This is going around the world. I mean, let's not forget that shortly we'll be having the US elections. So this is a discussion that's happening on every single scale. In the UK, a few months ago, we had our elections. In France, recently, there were the elections. And these are discussions that are being had around the world. What do you think? What do you think Gaza has had in terms of an impact on political awareness as well as the political discussion that's going on right now?
Well, I think Gaza has had a massive impact. Not everyone in Australia, but it has really reawakened so many people politically. It's brought people into political action who've never been involved in politics before. And I can give one example of a couple who contacted me after I got a pro-Palestine motion through my local council, and they contacted me wanting to do something similar with their local council. Mm-hmm. Never been politically active, but just the two of them started off a weekly vigil outside their MP, not connected to any groups, and they gave them advice on how they could maybe make contact with other pro-Palestine people in their local area. They're already coming to the big rallies, but then, they're full-on part of the movement. But just the fact that so many people are like that particular couple, never been involved politically, but horrified about what's happening in Gaza and don't believe the politicians' lies. So this is having a big impact, and also people who might be generally not terribly political and maybe follow major party lines, or their families always voted Labor, for example, suddenly questioning that. So maybe in the past they might not have been very political, just automatically voted Labor or whatever. And now they're not content with politicians just saying, oh, yes, it's sad what's happening in Gaza, but nothing we can do about it. Now they're demanding action, and they're demanding sanctions on Israel. They're not satisfied if MPs say, oh, yes, we support a ceasefire, but without calling for sanctions.
What is it that brought about, this kind of reaction? What is it?
Well, I guess...
Is it obviously, when we're talking about Gaza, we're talking about a massacre, a genocide that unfolded before our very eyes. Of course, I understand that. I understand that the horrific images, the numbers that are absolutely through the roof and almost unbelievable, that you can't really frame in words. But why? Why has the reaction been so profound in Australia?
Well, I guess for me, obviously people feel that with a genocide of this scale, silence is taking sides. If you are silent, you are taking a side, and that is the side of the perpetrator. But I think for many people, and certainly for me, that people reflected on their own experiences, and particularly people of colour, the Muslim community, Aboriginals in Australia, and discovered... and certainly particularly for the Muslim community, discovered how unjust the system is against them through seeing what's happening in Gaza, discovered that we have no voice, that there is some relationship building with government, but when it came to the crunch, that the Muslim community had absolutely no voice in terms of what's happening in Gaza. We were not able to change the government narrative. And I think for a lot of people, it's the same. It's reflecting on people's own experiences, minority groups and so on, and reflected on this and found the injustice in the whole system, the colonialism, and how it's affecting their day-to-day life, and reflected there in Gaza. And so this is, people say that, they were saying that we're not free until we're all free. That is so true, because the issue of Gaza has become not a remote issue halfway around the world, but it has actually we've realized what kind of system we're living in. So it's become internalized, it's become localized through that way. And this is why it is a huge movement. I mean, here in Melbourne, we've had now over 52 weeks of unrelenting protests. And when I say unrelenting, almost daily protests. We've had the massive weekly Sunday rallies, but through the week, almost daily action, protests, all sorts of activities, forums, and so on in response to this for 52 weeks, and people did not get tired. So they've internalized this, and they've found it's their personal problem as well, not just a problem halfway around the world.
Where did Palestine figure in the whole Australian political narrative in the past, before Gaza? I mean, when we're talking, and this is part of the question, Gaza has been under siege now for 17 years. And it was attacked on numerous occasions over the course of those 17 years. Why now? What's made that kind of shift? What made that kind of jump in terms of narrative, in terms of demand, in terms of expectation? I mean, the way you put it, were there earlier signs that this might happen? Before the 7th of October 2023, where did Palestine figure in the government's narrative?
Well, starting with the population's perception, I think things started to shift the first time that Israel started a massive bombardment after the blockade of Gaza. I think that started to shift people. I mean, I grew up in Western Queensland, in a remote area of Queensland, countryside, and, I was not really conscious about the issue of Palestine. In fact, my father told me that Northern Ireland and Palestine are all just mad religious people on both sides. That was my background. But then it was really the 1980s when I joined the socialist movement that I started to become more aware, but not hugely knowledgeable, with the massacres in Sabra and Shatila refugee camps. But I don't think in Australia there was much consciousness, especially in more regional, with other less populous states, about Palestine. But I really think Israel started to damage its reputation when the wall went up around Gaza and people couldn't escape, and there was massive bombing and people couldn't find where to escape the bombing. And then Israel's had a number of bombing campaigns since then. Now social media is way more dominant now, and also people have been able to communicate via WhatsApp and Facebook, etc., directly with people in Gaza. And so many people have been massacred and pushed around by Israel within Gaza that it means there's a lot of families affected here in Australia, especially Sydney and Melbourne, but also other cities as well. And one woman I met locally had lost 120 members of her family by December last year. I don't know if there's anyone left now, but that has a big impact in society. And while, yes, there might be some people in Australia who are just scrolling past the horrific stories on their phones and not engaging with what's happening, I think there are so many people who are so aware now, including Jewish people who've started to realise that they had been fed a lot of Zionist propaganda and are connecting with the anti-Zionist Jewish movement, who are part of very solid parts of the Palestine movement. So I trace the consciousness back to the blockade of Gaza, and then it's gradually increased. But what we're seeing now is on such a scale that even the UN ran out of words to describe the extremity of it last year.
I mean, when we talk about the Australian government and successive governments, I'm aware of the fact that, you know, the Australian government successive have been more or less in line generally with the positions of, let's say, the British government and the American governments of late. I mean, there hasn't been really much departure, and especially in terms of policies regarding Palestine. Now, obviously, both of you are interested in the coming elections, whether it be the council elections or the federal elections sometime next year.
Council elections.
So the question is, you know, what are you hoping to do? Is there appetite for actual change? I come from, you know, our experience recently in the UK with the elections and the fact that people, in their droves, they voted for something else. And Palestine and Gaza were elementary. I mean, even if in Labour's landslide victory, they know for a fact that their share of the vote was less than when they lost in 2019, and less even than when they also lost in 2017. So everyone is aware of the imprint and the impact of Gaza on the elections. But to what extent? What are you hoping to achieve?
Well, I think because we haven't had any elections in Australia, I think, since it started this genocide. So I think this council elections happening right now as we speak, a postal election, is going to be probably the first metric that we see. And certainly for candidates like Sue and myself, so for example, for myself, I've come through even at local level with a clear pro-Gaza position, including in the promises that I've put on my leaflet. So how does that impact? And I'm running in a normally Labour ward as well, so a shift in that will be quite significant. So I think we're going to see a metric, I guess, after these elections. People are watching this election and know that it's going to affect the federal elections coming up soon. And Labour Party definitely, particularly in certain federal seats in Australia, are feeling the heat already. So much so that even some federal current members of parliament are looking for alternative seats because of the amount of pressure they are in their particular seats at the moment. So I think the pressure is there. Does it result in just a margin reduction or actual shift in seats? I hope the latter. And also at council elections, it's particularly complicated because there is a narrative that council should not have anything to do with global issues. And this is a narrative that people like Sue and myself are trying to argue against. That yes, it is relevant. It's relevant because it's a moral issue. It's relevant because if you how can you trust a councillor that turns a blind eye to a genocide? How do you trust a councillor if they turn a blind eye? How do you trust them that they're going to stand for your benefits as opposed to the benefits of land developers or people with a lot of money, for example? So it becomes a moral issue, I guess. So for me, it's a very moral issue. It's something I've taken my electoral photos with my kufiya on publicly to make a public statement of the reason I'm running.
I understand you're not, your background isn't political. You've just basically been motivated to join the Green Party because of Gaza.
Oh, I've been with the Greens since 2017, but as essentially just a member. Absolutely, it was only, and I think absolutely, it was only Gaza that triggered me to run. It's given me the enough motivation that I felt because I'm part of also a movement called Darabin for Palestine, which is Darabin is the council I'm in, and we've had a very strong campaign, a staunch campaign against the council to try and get them to pass a motion similar to the motion that Sue was able to bring at Marybeck Council. And our ability to have the massive number of people trying to overcome a minority Zionist group in Darabin that is trying to lobby the council, and the outcomes has basically made me feel, well, I'm a Muslim, I'm a pro-Palestinian, and I'm not being heard. And yes, we have movement outside the council, and we have pressure from outside the decision-making circles, but we've also got to have people on the inside, people who are actually representing the majority of people, at least in my council anyway.
Do you know that there are big numbers of people who have been motivated to join?
Well, I would say particularly, so specific numbers, particularly for the Muslim community, and this has never happened before, right? The Muslim community has got 60 candidates 60 candidates running for council. This has never, ever happened before.
This is across all parties?
This is correct, across all parties, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
How impactful has the movement for Palestine, the campaign for Palestine? I mean, you spoke about going back probably 30, 35 years. Have you seen that? Do you see this as something which has become an effect on Australia and Australian society as well as on Australian politics? Has it grown? Or was it Gaza particularly that drove this kind of momentum, if you wish, forth? Or has it been something accumulating over time, over the years, over the crimes and massacres committed by Israel?
I think there has been a slow increase of consciousness of the injustice of what's happening in Palestine over the years. But I think Gaza, like this, what's happening, this current genocide is on a
different scale. And also I think people can see, because there's a war in Ukraine, people can contrast the responses. So Russia invades Ukraine. Okay, I don't support the Russian invasion in Ukraine, but the Western world, using that term loosely, put immediate sanctions, many sanctions on Russia. Not a single sanction from the US or Australia on Israel. Yeah. The US could stop this genocide tomorrow by switching off the arms shipments to Israel and persuading its allies to switch off the arms shipments. So the rest of the world could have a big impact on what's happening in Gaza at the moment and Lebanon now. And so, I think this is what has dramatised things. And then after the pro-Palestine motion that I got through in Marybeck, well, actually before that motion... What was the motion? Tell us a little bit about the motion.
Well, firstly, we organised the first of the local protests, and now there's many local protests happening all over Melbourne, suburban protests. So we organised a big protest. It was 2 days after the bombing of Al-Shifa. About over 1,000 people came out. And then I moved the next opportunity I got at a council meeting in November. I moved a motion which was noted a whole lot of things, but basically called on the government to call on the federal government to call for an immediate and permanent ceasefire. They were not calling for a ceasefire of any kind at that point, for an immediate lifting of the siege to allow unlimited supplies of food, water, electricity, medical supplies, construction materials, whatever people need in Gaza. Immediate lifting of that. I called for sanctions on Israel for Australia to cut all political, diplomatic, economic, military ties with Israel. And I called for the council to support the boycott, divestment and sanctions campaign by changing its procurement policies. And then there was a subsequent council meeting where and also the flying of the Palestinian flag from the council building. That was the other part of the motion. And so the flag is flying until there's a permanent ceasefire. That's what we've agreed to, and that can't be taken down without a motion by, a report or decision of councillors. And we've also now had a subsequent report to councillors on companies that the council procures things from, which are involved with the Israeli military and supporting the genocide in Gaza. And so they've changed the procurement policy to ban any contracts with companies involved in weapons production for anywhere, not just Palestine and Israel, but anywhere. And they've ended 4 contracts with companies that supply the Israeli military with all different sorts of services. So that was a concrete example of what I got through.
Fantastic.
But possibly that motion might have been watered down by other parties if we hadn't have had the protests first and I hadn't pressured the mayor to attend the protests. They weren't going to attend at that time, but I pressured them, and then they got to see how big the protest was. And then after my motion got through, then other groups started forming in different local council areas, first in Maribyrnong in the western suburbs, then Dandenong, which has a high Muslim population, fought to get a motion up at their council. And then after Dandenong passed their motion, then people started thinking, well, there's all these other areas where there's big Muslim community. We should be, forcing the councillors to pass motions to support there. So all these, a flood of little groups in different suburban areas set up. That has put, and the fact that they're pressuring councils is putting pressure on federal and state MPs, so they can't just escape. And because we're just protesting in the city, they can't escape the movement because we're pressurising them in the suburbs. And while we haven't succeeded in forcing the government to implement sanctions on Israel, what we have succeeded in doing with the over 52 weeks of protests is we haven't allowed the government. Well, the government initially would have thought the movement would have gone away. We'd have all forgotten about Gaza. A little tiny group would still be doing stuff in support of people in Gaza, but the issue would have gone away politically. It hasn't gone away because of our protests, and they've even had to wriggle around to try and change the narrative of now they talk about ceasefire but without sanctions. And then they had to try and say, oh, we're not really arming Israel, but actually they're sending weapons parts which go into Israeli weapons. So it might not be the entire F-35 bomber, but, the parts that allow it to function. So they've been forced to change their narrative to try and retain support. Not good enough, the movement has said. So we've got them under pressure. We haven't built sufficiently to force them to carry out sanctions, but they are feeling the pressure. And we've also educated the Australian public and people on the difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. People, have become aware that there's a whole current of anti-Zionist Jews who support the Palestinians. All sorts of people have come together in this movement, and it has gone all over Australia, including little tiny regional towns as well, in quite isolated areas. Like I've seen isolated protests in the Northern Territory, like pictures of them, and they might not be having the same level of frequency as what we have, but they've definitely had protests. And there've been various individuals, like has happened in all over the world, individuals have made brave stands, like this pianist in the symphony orchestra who wanted to play a music piece, and he wanted to introduce it by talking about all the journalists who'd been killed in Gaza, and his performance was cancelled. And so there have been a lot of little examples of that, people in different professional bodies.
What's the level, with your interaction, especially with the young, what's the level of appreciation of the nuances of the case of Palestine? one thing that caught my attention in Britain is the fact that this time, Gaza, it's like it triggered something. I mean, all of a sudden, people understood that this has been going on since 1948. Most people used to talk about 1967 because that's what's clearly in the UN resolution. But 1948 all of a sudden became something that people recognized. The Nakba, the term Nakba, okay, was something that now all of a sudden people, and particularly young people, are using more and more. How do you assess the level of understanding and awareness of the history of the cause, the progression and the various landmarks within the cause over the course of the past 76 years? And, you know, how has that also impacted the ability to formulate a narrative that would impact the political reality of Australia?
Well, I guess in terms of reflections on young people, I mean, the first thing I think is what I observe about this movement is that it's global to a certain extent. So we're influenced by what happens elsewhere. So, for example, we've had here in Melbourne, and in fact across Australia, significant protests and encampments on campuses, for example, at universities. They were triggered almost within days from what happened in the US, for example.
In America, yeah.
So it's we're definitely people are very well aware of what's happening elsewhere, thanks to social media, and ideas are shared and so on, and it happens, and it just gets organized very quickly. We do have, I think, a generation of young people who are, and particularly also within the Muslim community, who I haven't seen before, particularly younger women as well, who have an incredible amount of leadership skills, an incredible amount of integrity, and an incredible amount to ability to organize community and bring things like that to bear very, very quickly. And that's something that I find very inspiring. A lot of these, particularly Muslim women in particular, who may not have found an opportunity to voice, to find their voice, I guess, including through existing Islamic organizations, all of a sudden they have found an avenue to speak up and to lead through movements who are not really organizations but just movements, but also organizations that are newly founded to be able to bring that to bear. And that includes there is a lot of capacity building as well, I think through the processes that, including for myself, we've all had to learn things that we've never had to do before, from all sorts of weird and from, there are people who've never spoken in public before, and all of a sudden they found themselves in a situation where they have to speak to the public. They have to speak to thousands of people in a rally, for example, and they had to learn that, and they had to do it in days. To even simple things like, picketing, for example. And it was the first time for me ever to actually do pickets where you're in direct confrontation with the police, for example. And how do you deal with that situation? How do you keep your safety? How do you look after the safety of others? To things like even simple things as drumming for rallies, for example.
Yeah,
so
it's quite the art.
I went.
It's not something that anyone can do.
I went and bought a drum, and I've never drummed. so it's I find that incredibly inspiring. And I think we've got a movement. Like, I go to rallies now, and I feel at home. I feel amongst family. I feel amongst hundreds of faces and long-term relationships. I hope so. There is a lot of capacity building, and I think there is a lot of. I hope that this, regardless of whether a ceasefire happens in Gaza or not, that we've got a movement that is able to change reality.
Let me bring up something which is a little bit more about foreseeing. all this is fine and proper. There's a genocide going on, an immense crime that is going on. The images are stark. The stories are heart-shattering. There's no question. And that many, many people reacting to that, I don't think that in itself is a surprise. What if a ceasefire was found tomorrow? And let's hope it is. Let's hope the killing stops somehow. What if Netanyahu in Israel sat down and said, where's the piece of paper? Let's sign and no more shelling. Okay? What then? Do you go back home, Sue? Do you take off your kufiya? Do you stop drumming, Mohammad? Enough already.
No, I don't think.
What does this mean? Let's not say on the long term. What does this say in terms of its long-term impact on Australia and Australian people? And what kind of impact, whether it be mid-term or long-term, on Australian politics?
Well, I think a large number of people in the movement, and I think the message, certainly the message I've been saying, and I think a number of other people are saying, is that Israel has destroyed so much in Gaza that we can't go home the day there's a ceasefire. And in fact, what has awakened in a lot of people who started out just being horrified by the industrial scale killing being carried out by Israel in Gaza is that people recognise we need to tear down these walls around Gaza, and people are calling for an end to the occupation of Palestine, however that might come about. I think people are starting to develop a recognition that the whole occupation of Palestine is wrong, and somehow there needs to be a single democratic state for all who live in the region, not an occupation where people are second or third class citizens. And so I think there's a much, much greater percentage of the rallies who have that recognition. And I think there would be a lot of people who would keep acting on it, but also the scale of destruction is so bad that it's, there was some report of the UN which talked about 50 or 70 years to even rebuild Gaza to the point it was before the current genocide. So, yeah, there's it will still be a catastrophe after a ceasefire. But in addition to that, I think what's happened is there's an intersection between the Palestinian struggle and the anti-colonial struggle, and there's been an upsurge in consciousness around First Nations, First Nations rights, and so there is a connection there. And for a lot of First Nations people, especially the activists, the grassroots, not necessarily the bureaucrats, but the activist grassroots, they're looking at what's happening in Palestine and thinking, that's what happened to us, where entire clans were genocided and lost, and the languages lost and so forth. So there's still a lot of languages left, or little tiny people trying to rediscover their languages, but people can see, and people have talked about the number of Palestinian family lineages that have been killed, totally killed, totally wiped out. So that's in the consciousness amongst the activists in the movement. But then also the other thing I think coming out of this movement, which is a bit similar to the anti-Vietnam War movement, I was too young to participate in that, is that the anti-Vietnam War movement created so many activists, and some maintained links with Vietnam, but people became trade unionists, socialists, feminists, anti-racism activists, migrant rights activists, all sorts of different environmental activists. It awakened people's understanding of society so that people became ongoing activists for the betterment of society. And I can see that happening with the Palestinian movement, because people are active on so many fronts, And I think one thing that's really important that the Palestinian movement has created in this country is the understanding that it is evil for Australia to have shifted its manufacturing industry from civilian uses to weapons production.
Yeah.
That's happening as we speak, bipartisan policy of both major parties. And I think this awareness, which has started mainly around weapons companies supplying Israel, I think people have become aware that Australia's involved in this horrific AUKUS agreement with Britain, US, which is trying to drag us into a war with China. And people are starting to become aware that Australia's military alliances are, have to be ended with the US. And I think this is it's like any significant social struggle gets people thinking about society, and people like Mohammad, other people who've suddenly discovered their councils are shit, won't even accept a petition, or people suddenly discovered how bad our political system is. And so that's what's also prompted people on this local level as well. And then the anti-colonial struggle, where there are a lot of young people now who are much more like maybe their parents were, had experience of colonisation in their countries, but the younger generation, because they've grown up in Australia, they've got more confidence to act on their own behalf and get stuffed any racist who says, go back to where you came from, whereas the parents who first migrated might not have that same confidence. So a lot of the younger generation of activists who come from different backgrounds of colonised societies are also saying, and the Palestine movement has brought together, it's consciously aired other anti-colonial struggles such as the Kanak struggle, the Tamil struggle, the refugee struggle, all of these different sort of connected struggles, even an attack on the main union that's given support to the Palestine struggle. All of these struggles are being reflected into the Palestine struggle.
It's interesting you say this because in a previous episode, I asked the question to my guests saying that, Australia in itself is a settler colonial project.
Yeah.
And but I would say that Australia is probably far ahead of countries like the United States or other countries in terms of trying to recognize its past. Probably, I might be wrong. This is what I contend. How on earth could it, from that particular vantage point, how on earth could it lend its support, its overwhelming support, its absolute support, to another settler colonial project, such as the one happening in Palestine? This is one interesting aspect. But I'm interested in what Sue just said in regards with people recognizing maybe something else. All of a sudden, it's not about Gaza. It's about Australians.
I think I want to actually, to add to what Sue has said, and perhaps in response to your earlier question about what's different about this time. And I think that what's different this time is that the movement internationally is underpinned by the strength of resistance in Gaza. Now, we're used to, Israel will bomb, and then the Palestinians will resist for a couple of weeks, and then there is a ceasefire and it all ends. This time it's different. This time people in Gaza have said, well, you know what, we've had enough with being humiliated, with being under siege, with being kept under control, and we want our freedom and we want our dignity. And that's what they fought for, and that's what's different about the 7th of October. And they are out, not because they're not asking for a ceasefire, they're asking for their freedom. And therefore the famous term, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And I think the movement globally is actually responding to their local resistance. It's empowered by Gazan resistance. We see on TV people saying, common civilians saying, we will back the resistance. It doesn't matter what happened to us, we will back the resistance. And I think the global movement is responding to that by saying, well, you know what, even if there is a ceasefire, we're still going to come out until Palestinians are free. And with that, they found strength to be able to face, whether they're First Nations or minority groups or people of color or Muslims, they found strength to fight for their own cause as well. So all of a sudden, I think the issue of Gaza has become a global movement of seeking freedom and dignity against any colonial project and any imperialistic project, and against power and elite and money in preference to the common person. So I think that's what's different here. It's underpinned by Gazan resistance, absolutely.
Yeah, I take it that the situation in Australia is not too dissimilar from the one in Britain and in most European countries, as well as the United States, in terms of those in the halls of power and authority are generally taking an pro-Zionist, pro-Israel line. And I'm going to come to Australian media in a little bit, because I do think that the media are influential in whatever scene it is. But one of the things that often take my interest is the fact that in all our cultures, especially when we talk about films or TV shows that we binge on, or the such. Always, our sympathies and alliances have been with the underdog. Always, In fact, in many shows that I'm sure that we can all together remember several, the element called the resistance is always, the place where we support. I mean, obviously, that goes without question. Yet, it seems in real life we're being driven or drawn or pushed to actually support the empire, or to support and this in itself, I believe, has an impact on two levels. The first is it's enforcing a narrative where basically might is right and whoever holds the gun bears the truth. I mean, that's one narrative. But the other, which I feel that people on the streets are responding to, is the one about that this doesn't fit with our general conception of whom should gain our sympathies. And sometimes it doesn't even matter, whether or whether you understand the nuances and the intricacies of the conflict. It just makes sense that, you stand by and support and sympathize with whoever's being kicked whilst they're down. So this, I mean, I'm interested in your take, but also the status of Australian media. Tell me about that a little.
So going back to the earlier part of your question, I think often what happens is, well, in popular culture, yes, it's true, people identify with the underdog, the people who are resisting nasty governments or nasty corporations. But what the governments, politicians, mainstream politicians, ruling class are very good at doing is knowing how to divide and rule using prejudice, fear, et cetera, et cetera. And that's where the media is very expert. In this country, the media has been very expert in turning people against refugees often in this country, or trying to scare people about Muslims or Aboriginal people or this group or that group. The group might change from time to time, but after September, after the 9/11, there was such a huge wave of racism across Australia, not as bad as the United States, but still bad. And so they play on those sort of prejudices in order to undermine people's sense of justice and solidarity with resistance. But once people start to see, and anyone who's sort of at least open-minded, who looks at what's going on in Gaza, then, people start to see through the propaganda. And I do agree with Mohammad about the question of resistance, because also resistance, I think, does make people think, they're fighting, there must be a good reason to fight. And in the refugee movement, I know when refugees in the detention centre, sometimes thousands of kilometres away in Nauru or wherever, have been on hunger strike or fighting and protesting, sometimes that's led to a renewed wave of the refugee movement. So there's always been like in the refugee movement, an interaction between the resistance by refugees themselves as well as the protest movement here. So that's always been a thing. But I think the media is, they've had, probably 100 years or more maybe of developing their expertise in trying to manipulate public consciousness around, like to create prejudice against particular people, sometimes with false stories or the way they might talk about a story which could be, could be elicit sympathy from and support and solidarity from the population, but they can know how to do a little twist to make you think, maybe they're not really being honest and I'm being they're trying to, tug at my heartstrings. And they've skilled, they're skilled at this. They've been doing it for so long. And, obviously the Murdoch media is the worst, but all of the media has been terrible. And I think that's...
Even the left-leaning media?
I guess it depends on what you mean by, in terms of the mainstream media, sometimes people are shocked about the ABC, which is often seen as more neutral. I mean, of course, no media is neutral, but often regarded in Australia or amongst a layer of the population as being more neutral, i.e. not like the Murdoch media.
Yeah.
But the ABC, I think over the years, the government has stacked it with real right-wingers. It's very subject to attack from the Zionists as well as other right-wing characters. And so sometimes actually the ABC has been worse than some others. Yeah. In the past, The Guardian has been terrible. I know in Britain they have, led the whole... tried to portray Jeremy Corbyn and other Palestine supporters as being anti-Semitic when they were just supporting, Palestine.
Of course.
So The Guardian, those sort of more, if you mean left liberal, I think, they haven't always been good and have kowtowed to Israel and so forth. I mean, I think the genuine left media, as in the socialist groups, but of course our media doesn't have big influence, has generally, most groups are very solidly in support of Palestine. But I think the Palestine movement has had some impact because while the media is still terrible, we have forced them to recognise the Palestinian viewpoint, not as much as we'd like, but, it's not as bad as it was at the very beginning after the 7th of October. And so now the focus is a bit more talking about the violent, dangerous protesters who are disrupting things. And obviously around the anniversary of 7th of October, it's all about the people who died in the kibbutz, not all the people who are dying in Gaza, but also there's no reflection in the media about the fact that really what happened on the 7th of October, it was a prison breakout of prison.
Yeah.
It was a prison breakout. That's really what it was.
Yeah.
Did Israel really think Palestinians were never going to try and break out of this prison? How long, how many decades do they think people are going to be stuck inside an open-air jail? So there's no context in the media. It's just, and there's never been anything that I've seen in the media, maybe others maybe there has been, but I haven't seen it, a reflection of those reports in Haaretz in Israel about the fact that Israeli military killed a lot of their own people on the 7th of October. I've never seen that reported in the Australian media.